Corruption in Africa is usually spoken about like it is a fixed problem, like it sits in one place and just needs to be removed. But in reality, it shifts shape depending on how systems are built, especially when reforms keep getting layered on top of each other without enough time for anything to stabilize. Because when systems are constantly changing, the space between old rules and new rules becomes the most dangerous space. That is where accountability gets a little blurry. And that is where corruption often grows quietly and inconsequentially at first. Look at Kenya's procurement system over the last decade. It has gone through repeated reforms, stuff like digital procurement platforms, new oversight requirements, revised tender rules. The list goes on. And on paper, each reform is meant to reduce leakage. But what often happens in transition periods is confusion in the enforcement part. Different agencies interpret rules differently while systems are being rolled out. And during those gaps, inflated tenders and duplicated contracts tend to appear, not because the system has no rules, but because the rules are changing faster than enforcement can even fully settle. South Africa gives another example through state-owned enterprises like Eskom and Transnet. Over the years, multiple reform attempts have been introduced with new boards, new restructuring plans, governance frameworks, and oversight committees. But each cycle overlaps with a previous one before full stability is reached. And in that overlap period, procurement chains become harder to track. Investigations into procurement irregularities often point to the same pattern. They highlight shifting oversight responsibilities or unclear accountability lines and contractors exploiting timing gaps between policy changes. Nigeria's oil sector also shows this pattern in a different way. Reforms around subsidy renewal, revenue tracking, and fuel import regulation have been introduced repeatedly over time. But during these transition phases, subsidy systems themselves become points of exploitation. Reports over the years have shown large-scale discrepancies between reported imports and actual fuel distribution, especially when policy changes are in progress. Again, it is not the absence of reform. It is the instability during reform cycles that create room for manipulation. Even at a regional level, institutions like the East African Community Customs Systems show similar pressure points. As countries try to harmonize trade procedures, customs reforms and new digital tracking systems do not always roll out evenly across borders. That right there creates uneven enforcement between ports of entry. Goods can be processed under different interpretations of the same rules depending on timing and location. That inconsistency becomes a structural opening. Not because corruption is formalized in those places just yet, but because systems are not fully aligned yet. So the pattern is not that reform is bad, reform is necessary. The pattern is that constant reform without consolidation creates temporary instability. And instability is where corruption adapts fastest. It does not always need broken systems. It just needs systems that are constantly in motion. This is why frequent restructuring can sometimes increase the problem that it is trying to solve. Every new framework resets procedures. It shifts responsibilities and it delays full enforcement maturity. And in those delays, actors inside the system learn how to operate in the gaps. It won't always be through straight up theft, but through small adjustments that add up over time, like timing manipulation, contract splitting, or playing around with regulatory ambiguity and weak coordination between agencies. The real issue here is not just corruption itself. It is the rhythm of governance. If reform cycles are too fast, systems never fully stabilize. If they never stabilize, enforcement never becomes consistent. And if enforcement is inconsistent, corruption does not disappear. It just learns to live inside the transition periods. So the focus cannot only be on adding more reform, it also has to be about slowing down the cycle enough for systems to actually settle and take root so that accountability is not constantly restarting alongside policy. It is okay for us to walk before we run. It is so okay.